Nick Cruz is a citizen journalist and a co-founder of Revolutionary Blackout Network, which sounds a little bit frightening. Nick Cruz joins us now. Nick, thanks. I'm amazed there's a huge body of people waiting to see you here. You're obviously a star in your own orbit. Let's take you to the wider world because you deserve it. First of all, in a nutshell, your thoughts on yesterday's elections.
So thank you for having me on, George. And I said this on Revolutionary Blackout as well. It literally did not matter who won during the midterm election. The working class will lose no matter what. The military industrial complex will win no matter what. George, Goldman Sachs never lost an election. So Goldman Sachs is more than happy no matter the Democratic Party wins or the Republican Party wins. And I'm going to share my thoughts on the midterms and the results. But I want to make it clear to you guys, if you're watching in the UK or other countries as well, the United States, we have no functioning democracy. Despite what you hear from Democratic Party operatives, where we're going to protect our democracy, we live in a capitalist dictatorship. What do you call a democracy, quote unquote, where you can predict the winner at around a 95% success rate, just simply based on who raised the most money? That is not a democracy. We do not have the ability to get working class, anti-establishment people to win in our quote unquote election. It's literally a competition between the capitalist bourgeoisie. And I'm gonna give you guys another example. In this election, you had George Soros, who spent $128 million on this election. Then the number two was like 75, less than half of that. But if you was to bring this up, the Democratic Party will call you anti-Semitic just by bringing up the fact that George Soros has completely bought out the Democratic Party. Val Demings lost to Marco Rubio despite raising over $70 million. The Democratic Party is a complex money laundering scheme. Imagine if this money was spent on our community, that was actually spent on helping people. Now, there was a lot of predictions that we were going to have a red wave. And that's the historical trend, because whenever the president takes charge, they tend to lose the House and Senate afterwards. And the corporate media always says this, and they never offer an explanation. George, why do you think that the party in the presidency always lose the House and Senate in the midterm after? That's not an accident. That happens because Americans are brainwashed. They believe that a party will have their best interests at heart every 2 to 4 years. And then their team get in charge and they like, oh, I remember why they suck now. So then the next party come in and they clean up. Now they expected a red wave to happen, even though it's still likely that the Republicans are going to take the House. You had John Fetterman at one. It's more like a red trickle, if anything. And we can have a lot of discussion about why that is, but both parties have been deeply unserious in pushing the culture war issues. You had the Republican Party, all they had to do was to shut up, to shut up and be normal, because Biden has been so horrific for everyday working class people. But they spend every waking second of every day talking about trans people in bathrooms, trans people in sports. They do nothing but push culture war, white identity politics. And then they wonder why it wasn't a red wave. And I'm not saying the Democratic Party don't do the same thing either. I'm gonna pass it back to you, George, but both parties push the culture war to distract from the fact that both parties do the bidding of the military industrial complex, the prison industrial complex, and Wall Street. George, if I wanted to vote to limit the amount of funds that we were sending Israel as they bombing Syria and committing a genocide against the Palestinian people, what is my option on the ballot? If I wanted to limit the amount of money that we send to Nazis in Ukraine, who's my pick? If I wanted to limit the scope and power of the prison industrial complex, there is no option for us in the United States. That's what I mean when I say this is a capitalist dictatorship.
Well, very powerfully expressed, if a little depressing. Forgive me. The money issue. Let's talk that first. Chris Hedges just told us that Hillary Clinton spent $1 billion to lose the presidency to the one man in America that she shouldn't have ever lost it to. A clown, a game show host. And she spent $1 billion and lost.
Yeah.
Fetterman, the guy, the stroke victim, you just referred to him, who can no longer speak, who lived with his mum and dad until he was 50 years old, whose one foreign policy pronouncement is that America needs to get closer to Israel. He spent $100 million in one Senate race.
That's
Who
so
gives all that money?
I also want to remind people as well, not only did John Fetterman say he's going to lean in with his relationship with Israel, literally as they are bombing Syria, as they are assaulting Palestinians in mosque, he also was asked during his debate with Dr. Oz, what is the number one foreign policy threat to the United States? And he mentioned that we got to do everything we can to combat China. And that is the quote unquote progressive option that we have in the United States. A guy who also is staunchly in support of the Ukraine proxy war. And this is the guy that was sold as a progressive. The progressive movement, as we know right now, is a pro-war movement. John Fetterman, just one example. You had Frost Maxwell Frost, the first ever Gen Z, and I saw a lot of excitement on liberal Twitter about this. The first ever Gen Z guy was elected to Congress, and the reason why he was elected to Congress because he took dark money from Zionists, and he turned his back on Palestinian groups after infiltrating those groups. So you had John Fetterman, you had Maxwell Frost, Nina Turner before him, Jamal Bowman right now, who had the same voting record as Elliot Engel. The only way the progressives can get elected is if they sell out Black people, they sell out Palestinians, indigenous people, and they are funded by George Soros and Zionists. The Squad, Bernie Sanders, AOC, John Fetterman, Val Demings, who just ran in Florida, was given an insane amount of money from the George Soros war tank. And that is fed through the Worker Families Party organization. Then they give that money to the Squad. Then AOC give that money to corporate Democrats and CIA Democrats. There are a ton of working class people that are donating money to the progressive, thinking that they are going to fight money in politics. Now the Democrats broke midterm records this time, and now their projections, the 2020 election was already a ridiculous capitalist influx of money, but now 2024 is going to blow all records away. We don't even live in an illusion of a democracy. It's essentially a popularity contest between the ruling class. Now, Donald Trump, the real reason why they don't like Donald Trump, and just to be 100% clear with you guys, he's just an average member of the ruling class. Donald Trump just played their game better than they did. He understood the game. He was better at being an oligarch than Hillary Clinton. He was better at winning the popularity contest. When he got in, he hired Mike Pompeo, John Bolton. He hired a ton of Goldman Sachs. So he bought and paid for as well. It's just Donald Trump is just some guy who's better at playing the game than what they was. And that's why they was really upset at him, because he provided a bad face for the empire.
But hey, Fetterman wears a hoodie, and the Squad look good on the front page of Vogue and Vanity Fair. I call them the Bomb Squad now. There's not many advantages a person my age has over a person your age. But one of them is this, that we were alive in the 1960s when in American politics we had Martin Luther King, we had Malcolm X, we had Jack Kennedy and Bobby Kennedy, we had McGovern, we had anti-war movement of millions, we had students for a democratic society, and we had revolution outside the Democratic Party convention in Chicago in 1968 and so on. You're so young, you've only read about these things. What went wrong, Chris?
So I in
Nick,
my journalism, my citizen journalism, I focus on anti-war coverage, the class war, and state violence. And the reason why is because if you talk to a lot of people my age, we was influenced by the Iraq War. I was in high school. I grew up during the George W. Bush Jr. administration. So I remember the Iraq War and hearing the horrors of it, the Afghanistan War. And that is what led my generation to be way more anti-war. You can see this across the line. We are way more anti-war, more principally anti-war than the older generations who lost their way. Unfortunately, Barack Obama did an amazing job at killing the anti-war movement. The same way that Joe Biden killed the Me Too movement, the same way that Joe Biden killed the immigration justice movement. The Democratic Party is where movements go to die. There was a giant anti-war coalition in this country, not similar, but very similar to the Vietnam War that we saw in decades prior. Then Barack Obama came in, a very smart, very well articulate person, and he just slapped that momentum while dragging a ton of people to the right. And I'm speaking as a Black man here. He dragged a ton of people in our community to the right, turning a lot of people in our community to apologizing for these wars that we used to fight against. You mentioned MLK. MLK gave famous speeches and he was strongly against militarism. People think that MLK kicked up his feet and retired after 1965. After 1965, that is when white America really started hating him because he called out corporate greed, he called out poverty, and he called out militarism. The Black Panthers was famously known for being an internationally conscious community that stood in solidarity with the Palestinians. Malcolm X often talked about a war machine. We somehow went from Black revolutionary leaders who used to call out a war machine and the crimes that they did in Africa. Now we have Black imperialists. Now we have woke imperialists. We had Jean Pierre, who literally apologizing for U.S. imperialism on her own people. So to answer your question straight up, what went wrong? The establishment adjusted to the Vietnam protests and the Vietnam era. And now that we have the age of information and internet, and I see you cover this a lot, we cover this a lot, you see massive amount of censorship and disinformation that's coming from the government. Now, if you call out a politician, and there have been a lot of the progressive frauds like Bernie Sanders, Jamal Bowman, Ilhan Omar, AOC, who recently been called out because their support for the war in Ukraine. And their response to us was essentially call us Putin puppets, you spreading Russian disinformation. That is how brainwashed people have become. They repeat the old school propaganda line that we questioning our military industrial complex. We must be a puppet for the enemy regime. What we need, and this is related to the midterms that just happened, I don't vote Democrat or Republican. If you are anti-war activist and you vote for Republicans and Democrats, you are deeply unserious, whether you know it or not. Both are pro-war parties. We need a anti-war third-party coalition. I don't care if people I disagree with. The war machine and the prison industrial complex, which are connected, are so powerful. That needs to be the number one concern of workers, is to end that, because we do not benefit from the global empire. But anyway, George, I'll pass it back to you.
How can that be done, Nick? What the famous question, what is to be done?
I'm glad you asked this, because while I do bitch and complain about the problems of our society, I take pride in the fact that Revolutionary Blackout is actually a channel that leads the way in discussing solutions. There are a lot of nihilists in this space that just talk about the problems, but then when they are asked solutions, they end up just telling you to vote blue, trust a politician. No, we need to take power into our own hands. We have been educating people on mutual aid. And when I'm talking about building a third-party movement, I am talking about a movement. Studies show that you only need around 3 to 5% of the population to be on board with your message, and you can drive along a lot of people who are on the fence with you. And then there will always be 30% of the population that's against you. Those are the people you defeat. So the path that we need to do right now, I don't know if you know this, George, but studies show that 50% of American voters want a third party option. It is there's no professional managerial class messengers on the left that are trying to make that happen. In fact, they are active agents to fear-mongering against third parties. So in my vision of change, third parties in America, it's hard for us to win. but we need to focus on taking care of our material needs while building up a anti-war movement, an anti-capitalist movement, a proletariat movement. So we need to focus on mutual aid. That is what Rome is doing with Tour for the Poor. That is what we're doing, launching RBN chapters all over this country, so we can separate ourselves from the capitalist system. Once we separate ourselves from the capitalist system by building mutual aid societies, we show up and build those mutual aid societies via third party. So when we do our food drives, whenever we show up and help people, we're letting people know that we showed up. You have a mutual aid party that show up, that are taking care of the people while the politicians is abandoning us. We build this movement, we get on the debate stage. All we need is 5%. And a lot of people don't know that 5% in the third party gets you federal funding. 15% puts you on a national debate stage. Now, remember, 3% is all you really need historically to have massive social change. And then a lot of people, like, if you shut stuff down via general strike, there are a lot of people who are like, oh, just give them what they want, right? So you just need to build that momentum. If we had a third party to get 5% federal funding, running on popular ideas, economic populism while ending the war, that coalition is already here. We just need to put it together. Then if we get to 15%, we're talking about a real game changer where we had a third party candidate. What I would like to see a populist, anti-war third party candidate calling out neocons on both sides. And if you got 15% of the population, enough to get you on the debate stage, you're talking about serious coalition building power that the establishment have to acknowledge. And if they don't acknowledge and they continue to fight us and be anti-democratic, then we talk about general strikes. Then we talk about shutting society down. This is when we get into the topic that the boutique managerial class, a lot of people who are comfortable, they don't want to have the discussion because they don't want society shut down. But that is what we must do. And with the population and with the populace on our side, this is how you enact change. Now, George, everything I just described to you, this is a long process. Like, it's not easy. It takes a lot of revolutionary discipline, but that's why we need to get started right now. And I'm going to say one more thing, because I know I started with something that was initially depressing, talking about how we have no functioning democracy. We live essentially in a capitalist dictatorship. There are upsides to what I've seen this election. For example, I live in Missouri, a very red conservative state. We just legalized marijuana in Missouri. We also approved of an affordable housing project that will fund affordable housing up to $150 million. Also, in previous elections, we got Medicaid expansions. Like when it comes to direct democracy, that is our path to change, because the American people, the United States, is economically left. And if they are asked about policy ideas, they will vote in their own best interest. That's why in red state Missouri, they was able to have a Medicaid expansion. Now, George, could you imagine if we had a society where we would vote on Ukraine aid funding? Do you guys know how quickly the American people will shut that down? So there are upsides.
I'll tell you what I fear. I could talk to you all night, but I can't because the clock is against me.
Yeah.
Here's my fear. Put this in your pipe and smoke it. This legalized marijuana will send all your revolutionaries to sleep, and that's its purpose. But hey, call me old-fashioned. You certainly ain't. Nick Cruz, thanks for joining us
Thank you.
on the mother of all talk shows.